Hey guys, so we're going to start talking about Chapter 5, the evolution of biodiversity. And this chapter is pretty interesting because it's all about evolution and how species come to be. So the opening case study is called The Dung of the Devil. And what's really interesting about this is that it talks about the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. That epidemic lasted for 2 years and killed so many people. The mortality rate was between 20 and 100 million worldwide. About 600,000 people in the United States passed away from that pandemic. Ironically enough, we're going through our own pandemic here, with COVID-19. But what they found out after that pandemic was that there was this really cool species of plant that smelled really pleasant when it was cooked, but it was really foul smelling when it was raw. The sap was really stinky, and they called it dung of the devil. And but what they realized was that during this pandemic was that the Chinese used this plant to fight H1N1, the Spanish flu at the time, because it had antiviral properties. So what's really fascinating then is that during the epidemic of H1N1 flu in 2010, they actually pulled that plant out and started using it again to fight that pandemic. Some other medicines that we've used that we've gotten from different types of biodiversity is salicylic acid, which is how we originally formed aspirin. It came from willow trees. Rosy periwinkle has been used to treat leukemia and Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then the mayapple herb has anti-cancer properties. In addition to that, we've got lots of medications that or antivirals and antibacterial treatments that we've gotten from sponges and corals and sea squirts in coral reefs and in marine ecosystems. Some of them have also anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and anti-tumor properties. So most species that we know or are suspected of providing these kinds of resources for us are endangerment from anthropogenic causes such as deforestation, agriculture, development, fossil fuel extraction, and other human activities. So this just furthers our argument for the preservation and conservation of Earth's biodiversity. So I found this on the internet. It's just nothing that's in the chapter, but it's just interesting to look at. If you can look at in 1889, there was a Russian influenza. And then in 1908, the old Hong Kong influenza, H3N8. But then the Spanish flu of 1918 was the H1N1 that was so deadly. And even since then, we've had, several different pandemics, but nothing like the Spanish flu of 1918, and definitely nothing like COVID-19 that we're going through right now. So this chapter talks a lot about diversity and how diversity has come to be on Earth. And the first thing that we need to understand is that there's such diversity in ecosystems, and you guys have really learned this and thought about this, hopefully through chapter 4, by looking at and putting together the information regarding the different climates and different geographic locations of different biomes, and how those different biomes provide varying amounts of moisture and sunlight, and that's what precipitates these big differences in these biomes. And then we look at species diversity, which is just the variation of species within given ecosystems, and then genetic diversity, which is the variety of genes within species themselves. So this is just another way to look at it. Ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. Something that's really interesting to think about is the symbiotic relationships or the symbiosis between different species and how they interact with each other. And the word symbiosis can be broken down into smaller chunks, sym meaning together, bios meaning life, and then together, when we put that the two together, we get living together. And it just describes the close relationships that organisms have with each other. So not always do interactions within a couple of species are they positive. Sometimes they're negative, and sometimes there's no positive or negative to it. So you may remember this from freshman biology. Competition is the interaction of two species coming together and competing for a common resource. Neither of them necessarily benefits from this. Predation, one benefits while the other doesn't. Obviously, if the predator benefits over the prey species. Parasitism is, another benefits over the other. Same with herbivory, just one species feeding on plant species. Mutualism, both species benefit, and commensalism, one benefits and the other neither benefits nor is harmed. This is just an image that shows you 4 different parasitism and parasitoid circumstances. Parasitism is when one species preys on another to the detriment of the second species. And parasitoid is demonstrated in these 2 examples where one species might lay eggs in another host species so that the offspring of that, the one that's laying the eggs, can survive. And so this is a situation where babies have been laid on this caterpillar, and they're basically, they hatched and then have been eating it from the inside out. Kind of gross and kind of sad, but it happens. There's things that limit species, and we call those things limiting factors. We have density-dependent limiting factors and density-independent limiting factors. And those are the things that control our population sizes in different ecosystems. And so if we look at this side, the density, right here, the density-dependent side, competition, predation, parasitism, and disease are all density-dependent factors. That means that no matter how many are in the population, these things, competition, predation, parasitism, and other diseases, can limit the population. Density-independent factors are things that are not determined by the density. So density-dependent is determined by density, and density-independent is not. An example of a natural disaster or unusual weather event could be a hurricane, a tornado, or maybe a forest fire. It doesn't matter how many species are in the forest, for example. If a tornado comes or a fire comes and wipes out that entire forest, and those species are living in the forest at the time, whether it's 10 or 100, they're all going to be wiped out. So that's what density independent means. This slide is just to show you the difference between species richness and species evenness. So when we look at species richness, we're looking at the number of species in a given area. And so how many different species are there? Species evenness is the measure of whether that particular ecosystem has the same number of those different species, or are they dominated by differing numbers. And if you look at the 2 images, they both have the same types of species, but community 1 is much more even than community 2. So hence we would say that community 1 is more species rich, even though it has the same types of species in both communities. They're more evenly distributed in this one, so it is more rich. This slide is to show you the evolutionary relationships among species and how we determine that and what we look at. We look at this little tree image. It's called a phylogenetic tree, and we base where we put organisms on a phylogenetic tree on the similarity of their traits. And what's really interesting is that if you take a look at this gray arrow here, this represents over time. So past is at the bottom, present is up at the top. And the green forks in the phylogenetic tree represent branches where species have differentiated and developed. And so if you look at the very bottom where it says ancestor common to all descendants, the most common, or the branch point here indicates a speciation event. All of the species above this point have a notochord. So a lancet, a lamprey, trout, lizard, and chipmunk all have a notochord. And if you move to the right, each of these forks, where the fork begins, represents a place where a common ancestor existed to those species that are above it. So when you get here to the vertebrae, this means that all of the species above here have a vertebrae, including a lamprey, a trout, a lizard, and a chipmunk. And then if you move to this spot, you can see hinged jaw, and that means that all of the species above this point have a common ancestor that had a hinged jaw and led to the differentiation of trout, lizard, and chipmunk. So when we want to think about evolution, we want to think about what are the underlying mechanisms that lead to changes in biodiversity. So first of all, evolution is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time. Microevolution is evolution below the species level. So for example, if we're talking about different varieties of apples or potatoes or like the foods that we eat, and you'll see this development in grocery stores. All of a sudden they'll pop up with a new fruit or a vegetable and you're like, wow, how did that happen? Well, that's microevolution. Those species still can breed with each other, but they're just, we call them kind of, in the vegetable world or fruit world, we call them different varieties. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is evolution that gives rise to new species or new genera, families, classes, or phyla. So remember the taxons from earlier in your science career: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Species is the smallest taxonomic group, with genera being a group of species, and then as you move up, all the way up to domain. So when evolution occurs, we would say that an evolutionary, macroevolutionary event occurred if a new genera, family, class, or phyla was formed. Speciation is the evolution of a new species. And so we can't have speciation. We would never definitively say that speciation occurs at the microevolution level, but we would say it occurs under macroevolution. So when we're looking at genetic diversity, what does that really mean? Genetic diversity, we have to look at the genes, which is the physical location of chromosomes within each cell of an organism. So within your body, you're made of all different kinds of cells that make up all the different tissues, and those tissues make up your organs. Those organs make up your organ systems, and all those organ systems together make up you. Well, when we go back to the gene level, we're looking at the physical location on the chromosomes within each cell that code for traits within your body. So the genotype of those actual genes, or the alleles of those genes, are what give us specific traits. For example, if we're looking at tallness, and this could be in plants or animals, we look at, are we a homozygous dominant, a heterozygous dominant, or a homozygous recessive? So big T would be homozygous dominant, big T, little t would be homozygous recessive, and little t would be big T, little t would be heterozygous dominant, and little t would be homozygous recessive. A mutation is a random change in the genetic code, and that can happen because of outside environmental conditions, or it can be random. The phenotype is the actual set of traits that we have. So whether someone is tall or short would be the phenotypic expression that an individual has. The genotypic expression would be the actual alleles, like big T, little t, or little t. When we look at mutations, we want to determine, are they detrimental or not detrimental? And most mutations are detrimental. Because they represent a change in the genetic code. An example here might not be something that's deadly, but predisposes a species to environmental conditions that are not favorable. For example, the dusky-headed conure is a little bird that lives in the rainforest, and they're normally born with these green feathers. But once in a while, those feathers will appear blue. So if they're green, they have a tendency then to just be camouflaged within the green foliage of the trees. If they're blue, they have a tendency to stand out. And so they're more conspicuous for predators to see, and hence prone to predation. So that's a situation where the mutation didn't kill them, but it made them more susceptible. There is evolution by artificial selection and natural selection. So artificial selection is when humans determine the individuals that they want to breed. For example, racehorses is a really great example. We want to breed the best genes for racehorses if that's what we're trying to make money on. And so we take those horses that are the fastest, the strongest, the leanest, they have the best genes, and we breed them with other horses that have those similar genes so that they're the fastest and they can win. We also do this with modern crops. So we've had the ability to generate weed-resistant crops that are resistant to the herbicide Roundup, which is interesting because so in other words, what I'm saying is that the plant that we want to eat, maybe corn or wheat, we can insert genes within that plant that make it resistant to dying from the herbicide, and then all of the weeds that are growing within that monocrop do die. So this is a situation where we've manipulated potentially crops so that we can, coat them in herbicides. And I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just telling you what we can do. And then evolution by natural selection is something where we take individuals that are more likely to survive and we reproduce them with each other. Okay, artificial selection, another example would be plant breeders that have taken a wide range of edible plants from a single species, an ancestral species. For example, I love this one, wild mustard. There's an ancient or ancestral wild mustard plant that gave rise or has given rise to Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, and kohlrabi, which we know all of these are very different. These are the Cruciferae family, and they're all very healthy. In fact, if you eat these several times a week, it's going to make you a really healthy person. But what's really interesting is that their ancestral relative doesn't really resemble many of them too much if you look at the different shapes of each of these plants. Another example is the diversity of domesticated dog breeds that we've bred and are a result of artificial selection. What's really interesting about dogs is that all of our dogs, which a lot of people don't understand, stem from the wolf ancestor. And so even though they all look so very different, they are all the same species, dogs are, and they can breed and reproduce with each other. Now, Canis familiaris is the common dog, Canis latrans is a coyote, and Canis lupus is the gray wolf. So what's really interesting about that is that those are all different species. So the wolf is a different species than a dog, but all of the dog breeds, the Shar-Pei, the Chow, the Husky, the Saluki, all of these, all the way down to your tiny little dogs, they are still Canis familiaris and part of the same species. Okay, and that's why they can breed together. So how do we know about changes in species over time? A lot of it is based on what Charles Darwin did. There's been other people that have done a lot of work, but most of it is attributed to Charles Darwin work. When he was 22, he jumped on board this big ship called the HMS Beagle, where he originally was just supposed to be a hand on the boat, but because of his scientific literacy at the time and his inquisitiveness, he became a naturalist on the ship. And during his journey, during this 5-year expanse, he observed trait variation among species and found lots of fossil evidence of many extinct species. And this led to a big question about why, out of all the species that had once existed on Earth, only a small fraction had survived. And then that led him to his writing of the book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which was published in 1859. And during all of this research, the theory of evolution by Darwin, or the theory of evolution by natural selection that Darwin came up with, was based on these principles: that individuals produce an excess amount of offspring. There's fossil evidence of a large number of extinct species. Not all offspring can survive. Individuals differ in their traits. Differences in traits can be passed on from parents to offspring, and differences in traits are associated with differences in the ability to survive and reproduce. And so he used all this as his foundation to substantiate his theory of evolution. He also studied, well, I guess I should say it wasn't that it was a study, but he found this in this example with cichlids. So this is an example of natural selection. So I'm sorry, this isn't cichlids. This is these are little crustaceans. I'm looking at two screens here and I'm getting confused a little bit. But these crustaceans, when they're in nature, they produce lots of offspring. And we call the parent generation the P generation. Some of you guys might remember that from biology. And we call the second generation the F1 generation. Okay, so if you look at this image, here you've got the parent generation, and then you've got the F1 generation. And you notice that these little crustaceans will produce some large babies and some small babies. The larger offspring are, in this example, are more easily seen and eaten by fish, and so thus proportionally the smaller offspring survive and reproduce. So we would say that they have greater fitness. So over time you have, in the next set of parents, you would have maybe a large crustacean, this little amphipod breeding with a smaller one. And then instead of having three large offspring and one small, like in the first generation, look at the second generation, you've got only one large with three small. So over time, you can see that in this crustacean population that eventually the large crustaceans are bred out of the population simply because they're less fit. Not just because they're less fit, but they're the prey. They are much greater prey for the fish, is what I'm trying to say. Evolution by random processes can occur in 4 different means. First of all, mutations can occur. So this is random and can add to a lot of genetic variation in a population. So mutations, like I said before, they're not always detrimental, but oftentimes they are. But when we're looking at mutations that lead to evolution, we just have to remember that this is a random process. It's not something that's intentional. It just happens when species breed together. Genetic drift is the change in the genetic composition of a population over time as a result of random mutations. A bottleneck is a reduction in the genetic diversity of a population caused by a reduction in its size. And the founder effect is a change in a population descended from a small number of colonizing individuals. So let's take a look at what this might mean. I know this looks kind of blurry to you guys, but if you look at it in your book and read about this, it'll help you understand it. But this first example, just a mutation, is just a change in a population over time. So if you take a look at this, we've got, this breeding population where you have 90% of the species are white with only 10% black. And so that random mutation of that one black mouse can multiply over time through the generations. And that's basically what it's showing here in this image. And then in B, genetic drift is just when a large population, or in a large population, the genetic composition tends to remain the same over time. And in a small population, some of the genotypes can be lost by chance, and the genetic composition can change over time. So take a look up here in the upper part of B. For genetic drift, you've got a large population with pretty even numbers of black and white individuals. You've got 40% black with 60% white, and over time, you still maintain that 40% and 60% color difference. But if you have a smaller population, let's say with 40% black and 60% white, but you just have less numbers, you can see that over time, your population of black is going to be bred out, and it goes now to 80% white and 20% black, and eventually 0% black. So that's just an example, natural occurrence that can happen, and we call that genetic drift. Bottleneck is if a population experiences a drastic decrease in size or number, we say that it goes through a bottleneck, and some of the genotypes will be lost, and the genetic composition of those that survive will differ from the composition of the original group. And so if you take a look, you've got a brown population, black, brown, and white, so 40%, 10%, and 50% respectively. Over time, you have a bottleneck, and maybe only the brown and the black survive, and none of the white survive that bottleneck. So right here are your survivors. Then in the resulting population, there are no white survivors. So we call that a bottleneck. Today, an example of a bottleneck that's going on that the book talks about is the cheetah. The cheetah went through a bottleneck about 10,000 years ago. Scientists don't really know why, but their population decreased, and then it consequently left them with, a very small population of very genetically related species. And when that happens, that means that they're breeding and reproducing within each other. There tends to be a lot of genetic problems. And we have the same thing going on in America, in the United States, in Florida with the Florida panther, which is the same species as our mountain lion here in Colorado. But that group of Florida panther has been so isolated because of the huge population growth in Florida, and there's not much open habitat. Like, look at Colorado. We have all this land and open space where mountain lions can exist. Florida, you don't have that now with the huge population of humans there. And so they've gone through a bottleneck, and there's not much genetic diversity. We've actually taken some puma, we call them puma, in Texas, which is the same mountain lion, and transplanted them in Florida, hoping to bring more genetic diversity and get rid of some of that interbreeding that's going on. When you have interbreeding going on, it can cause problems with internal organs, and just they can be smaller in stature. It can affect, just think about it, we don't do that with humans, so we don't want to have children with our relatives, not only because it's not healthy, but it's just, it's not something that we do typically. The founder effect is just the last reason why you might have some evolutionary changes in a population. And this is when you have individuals from like a mainland that might colonize an island. And birds are a really good example. Or maybe it could be mice that make it onto a ship and then get off the ship on an island. But nonetheless, whatever the reason, you have a few of those from the mainland that actually make it onto this island, and they don't necessarily represent the entire population that's on the mainland. And so over time, those that make it onto the island become a new species. If they're ever brought back to the mainland, for example, they may have lived so long away from the mainland that they are now considered new species. Speciation extinction can determine biodiversity, and this is a really super cool example. When Darwin went to the Galapagos, he recognized this happening or this phenomenon, and what it was the differences in finches that lived on the islands, and he called this allopatric speciation. And it's what led to this variety of species. And if you look, I love this little chart because it shows you the different kinds of finches that there were. There were seed eaters and cactus flower eaters, and they were these guys right here. And they were even broken down, as you can see. And then there's tree finches, which are insect eaters, and they were all different types of finches as well. And then you've got warbler finches that were also insect eaters. But take a look at the differing sizes of their beaks and their heads, and just know that they all came from one common ancestor in South America. And so this is a great example of allopatric speciation. Another example of allopatric speciation is, let's say we had breeding populations in this field of white and black mice. And all of a sudden there was, the land rose and potentially, or sunk, and a river came through, and it separated the population into two. And you had unequal numbers on either sides of that river. Okay, and this, we're talking about a large river. Okay, so over many generations, each of the populations evolves independently, so that eventually you have a brown or black population over here and a white population over here, and they become so genetically distinct that once that barrier leaves, they're so distinctly different that they could never interbreed again. So that again is allopatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is the evolution of a species into two in the absence of geographic isolation. So it's usually through a process called polyploidy, where the number of sets of chromosomes increases, either on its own or, humans can do it as well. So we can cause sympatric speciation to occur, or it can happen naturally. Normally, species have two sets of alleles, one from mom and one from dad. That creates two. But through this speciation, we can have 4 or 6 alleles form. There are some species of sponges and even some amphibians can undergo polyploidy, which then can lead to sympatric speciation. But a really common one that we talk about would be wheat. The common wheat that we eat today, that we make pasta and breads from, we call that common wheat, but it has it's related to an ancestral wheat called einkorn wheat, and that evolved into through polyploidy 2 different types of wheat, the durum wheat and the common wheat. An example of rapid evolution are the cichlid fishes. This is what I was thinking I was talking about earlier when I got confused with the crustaceans, but this is the cichlids of Lake Tanganyika in Africa, and they evolved approximately 200 distinct and colorful different species of fish in a relatively short period of time when the lake formed in eastern Africa. And so this lake formed really fast. There was a major river flowing through the lake, and it's called the Ruzizi River, formed about 10,000 years ago. It enters the North Lake from Lake Kivu, and then the Malagarasi River, which is Tanzania's second largest river, that enters on the east side of Lake Tanganyika. But anyway, these cichlids are super cool. In fact, people like to breed cichlids because they're just so beautiful. But they evolved to be different feeders. Some are insect feeders, some are algae eaters, some are crustacean eaters, so on and so forth. So they all had evolved from a common ancestor. And this would be an example just of rapid evolution. Usually evolution takes, a really, really long time, but this happened very quickly. Some of the factors that affect the pace of evolution is the rate of the environmental change that's going on in an area, the genetic variation of a population, the population size, and then also the generation time. So how long it takes for a new generation to form. Evolution shapes the ecological niches and determines species distributions. And so when we look at an individual's fitness, what we're really looking at is their ability to survive a range of different conditions. And so we call that range of tolerance. And we all have it. So humans have our range of tolerance. I mean, you couldn't pluck us out of our home and just throw us in the polar biome and say, go live there without some kind of shelter or cover. We would die, very quickly. Likewise, to bring a polar bear from the polar biome and bring them down here to a desert ecosystem would be very difficult for them to survive. They're not adapted to survive in those conditions. So all of the conditions that are optimal for a species to survive are considered those are the abiotic factors that need to be met in order for that species to survive. And there's limits to the extremes in which or the ideal conditions in which that species can survive. So the ideal conditions we call the fundamental niche. And I want to show you this image that will help you understand this a little bit more. So the fundamental niche is all of these things that we need as well as all species needs. These are plants and animals, fungi, bacteria. Every living organism has their fundamental niche. But let's take a look at potentially temperature. And I like to use this next slide as a great example. Let me go back first and show you. If we're talking about the fundamental niche and we're talking about temperature, look at the range that's orange here. This would be the fundamental niche of maybe a species of fish. When you move outside of that, they can still survive and grow, but they can't reproduce. And then you move outside of there where the temperature is too hot or really too cold, they might be able to survive for a little while, and then the population is going to drop off. So let's take a look at this other example. I like this one a little bit better. If we're looking at steelhead trout, for example, and we want to look at the optimum zone of where steelhead trout can exist, we want to look right here in the middle where you see the highest arc in this little graph. That represents the greatest number. Well, if you move to the right and you move to the left, you're moving into what we consider the zones of physiological stress. So if we look at 21 degrees Celsius to 25 degrees Celsius, that's the upper limit of the zone of physiological stress. If we go the opposite direction and we look at 13 degrees Celsius and 9 degrees Celsius, we're looking at the lower level of physiological stress that a steelhead trout could survive in. But back here in the middle at about 17 degrees Celsius, that's where you're going to have optimum. It's the optimum zone where not only can the species survive, breed, and reproduce viable offspring. When you get to the zone of intolerance on both sides, so the zone of intolerance on the lower limit and the zone of intolerance on the upper limit, it basically means steelhead trout cannot live beyond 25 degrees Celsius or 9 degrees Celsius, lower than that. So this range of tolerance this shows you when we're looking at potentially one abiotic factor that affects steelhead trout, and its temperature. Trout in general and salmon in general need high levels of oxygen. And so one of the things that's directly related to temperature is oxygen. The higher the temperature, the less dissolved oxygen in the water. And so that can affect steelhead trout as well, their survival. The realized niche is the range of abiotic and biotic factors under conditions under which a species lives. And it determines the distribution of these species and where they can live. So a niche generalist is a species that can live under a wide variety of environmental conditions, and a niche specialist has very specific conditions that it has to live under. This is an example. This meadow spittlebug is a niche generalist with a broad diet. It can eat lots of different things, but the skeletonizing leaf beetle is a niche specialist and has a very specific or narrow diet. I think I might have told you guys about a student of mine who is doing work with the fritillary butterfly at Western State for one of his professors. He's since graduated from there with a biology degree, but his job was to climb mountains and to get to about 12,500 feet in elevation and do the transect lines. So I think when I spoke to you about this was probably the first or second week of school. But that was when he was looking for that fritillary butterfly. And that butterfly is a niche specialist. So it only lives at about 12,500 feet. But there's a niche generalist butterfly that looks just very similar to it, that can survive at all elevations. And so it was really difficult for Zach to, at first to identify the difference between the two. And he had to get really good at it, like which one's the fritillary and which is the niche specialist and which one's the niche generalist. So environmental scientists are really concerned with this because think about it. If you've got a lot of species that are niche specialists and you lose an ecosystem, or you lose plants in an ecosystem, then they're going to have a hard time surviving. This slide demonstrates changes in tree species distribution over time. And so this is after there was an ice age. It was interesting. They were able to look at the sediments that would indicate the different plants that had moved northward as temperatures moved following this retreat of the glaciers from this ice age. And they were able to look at this starting at about 12,000 years ago. But what's really neat is to look at the green just represents the vegetation, and look at how they moved in time more northward. So you can see that at like 18,000 years ago and then to present day, how those plants have actually moved more northward. So we're looking at both pine, spruce, and birch, or all three, I should say. Knowing this information, we can predict future species distributions. And so we can look at red pine distribution and loblolly pine distribution. We can look at where it is currently, and then we can look at, based on this data, we can look at, well, what might be the future of those two plants in the year 2100 based on what we've seen happen after geologic epochs where we've had ice ages. And so with our current situation of climate change occurring, would that affect the distribution of plant species, so trees that we have right now? Like would the pine trees that we have in Colorado and some of the aspen tree move more northward? Very potentially. The fossil record is the record that shows the remains of organisms that have been preserved in rock. And it helps us understand evolution because we can actually see species that have been preserved in time in the rock record. Because of that, we've been able to determine that there have been 5 global mass extinctions. I'm going to pause because I have a phone call coming in. So these mass extinctions occurred at these areas where you see these black arrows. The greatest mass extinction took place about 251 million years ago, where 90% of marine and 70% of land vertebrates went extinct. And then the most recent mass extinction was that at the end of the Cretaceous period. The Cretaceous period lasted from 150 million years ago to 65 million years ago. And that was the end of the dinosaur era, or the dinosaur period. And so, it's interesting because people don't want to believe that the Earth is as old as it is. But when we look at the fossil record and we can see that we had giant dinosaurs, which do not exist today on Earth, but they were here 65 million years ago, we have the evidence preserved in the fossil record. Now, what's really interesting about mass extinctions is that we really believe that we are in the sixth mass extinction, and it's really been occurring only since the last 2 decades. Estimates of extinction rates right now vary widely. It depends on where you go, and a lot of that is because we can't get to all the locations to determine all of those species. And remember, I've talked to you about the fact that we can go into very thick areas of rainforest and find new species even today. Even while we're losing species, we find new species. And so that's the reason that scientists they have a very hard time deciding or agreeing on the extinction rate, but somewhere between 20 and 25% was estimated when they wrote this book. In contrast to previous mass extinctions that were caused by natural events, the current mass extinction, the sixth mass extinction, is caused by humans or anthropogenically caused. There's actually a book that one of my former students gave me, and it's really fascinating. It's called The Sixth Mass Extinction. So if you're interested in a good read, grab that book. And then the last slide that I want to talk to you about just briefly is the case study at the end of the chapter. It's called Working Towards Sustainability, Buying the Oceans. And this is just about the oceans, the exploitation of our ocean dwelling species, primarily our shellfish, and that the Nature Conservancy has implemented plans to lessen the harvesting of these species. And they actually purchased some rights of shrimpers and other shell species along the coasts of the United States in order to control the harvest so that they're not taken, overabundantly. And the reason this is important because shell species, even though people don't find them very valuable, they are economically valuable. We love them. People love to eat shellfish, but they're super important to the health of marine ecosystems, especially those estuaries. The Chesapeake Bay has been overexploited, as well as a lot of the bays on the coast of New York because of the huge human population there. But these guys are unique because they're filter feeders. They clean the water. They eat a lot of algae, and they just keep everything in balance. And so we have to work towards being more sustainable with our use with these species. And so that's what this case study is. Take a look at that at the end of chapter 5. That is all I have for you guys today. I hope you have a great day and that you learned something new from chapter 5. Bye.